Hello, and welcome to the research video presentation. I am your host, Emily Edwards. On today's show, we will be discussing what the argument of nature versus nurture is and how it affects psychological disorders. To begin, we must dive into the argument of nature versus nurture and why there is an argument around it and what nature versus nurture is. To begin, nature is the biological factor of the argument, so it is inherited traits, while nurture is the environmental factor. So that would look like childhood experiences and influences in life, or triggers. So let's begin on what is being argued. Psychologists are arguing that one side, either nature or nurture, is more influential on human behavior. So that would be that childhood experiences and how you were raised is more influential on human behavior, or that your genetics is more influential. The argument for nature versus nurture in psychological disorders is that nature versus nurture plays a part in the development of the psychological disorders. For the nature side of the argument, it is argued that there are different types of disorders that develop due to genetics and the heritability of the disorder. This would be obsessive compulsive disorder and personality disorders. To defend this belief, here is my brother, Anthony. Hello, Anthony.
Thanks, Lou. To defend the argument that OCD is due to genetics, I will explain some family history. Our dad, who has OCD, however, has never been fully diagnosed. My sister and I both have OCD. However, my sister and I are both half-siblings. So we were raised in different homes. Genetics has played a large role in the two of us sharing these similar psychological characteristics. Back to you, Lou.
Thank you, Anthony. To argue for the position of nurture, I will be discussing eating disorders and how they could form by mothers. Mothers who control their children's food intake and create eating habits in their children can be the start of an eating disorder. By the mothers establishing food insecurities in their children, she can cause her child to have an eating disorder. The child could get insecure about how much they eat and get insecure about how much they weigh just from their mom telling them how much to eat. Or dad, it doesn't matter, it's the parents. And that goes along with the nurture part. To further elaborate on the nurture versus nature and psychological disorders, I'm going to describe a story for nurture. My ex-boyfriend, let's call him T, had a difficult childhood. T's parents went through a divorce and his mom got cancer shortly. However, she was fine. She survived. He went through abuse from both of his parents, from them beating them and mentally abusing them. After my therapist explained to me how dangerous our relationship was, she told me that he showed signs for a borderline personality disorder. The site Everyday Health explains that while there are three main causes, genes, brain abnormalities, and environmental factors, they all play into each other in the development of borderline personality disorder. This explains that nature and nurture is involved in the development of borderline personality disorder, which now transitions us into how nature and nurture can be combined to create psychological disorders. While both nature and nurture have their own arguments and evidence for psychological disorders, it is important to mention how they could combine and play a part in the development together. Children who have the genetic code for a mental disorder is at higher risk of developing that disorder if an environmental factor is involved, or an environmental trigger, like a life situation. While both nature and nurture have their own argument for psychological disorders, it is important how they can play a part in it together and combine to make a psychological disorder. Children who have the genetic code for a mental disorder is at a higher risk for developing that disorder if there is an environmental factor involved, which would look like a life situation, which would be considered a trigger. That's combining both nature and nurture. Another argument for this is children who have a biological parent who was an alcoholic and they could carry the gene, and they are more likely to have alcoholism if their adoptive parents were alcoholics as well. So that combines both nature, their parents having the gene and passing it along, and nurture, but their parents, their adopted parents, being alcoholics and them being in that environment. For treatment, therapy has been used to help their clients discuss and express the childhood trauma and work through what happened. And not only childhood trauma, but any triggers or life situations that could cause or has worsened their mental disorder, which can assist with the nurture side of the psychological disorder argument. While medication can help with the biological factor, which would be antipsychotic drugs, which would block dopamine receptors, and antidepressants, which would elevate serotonin levels, which is in the brain, which is part of the nature side. For treatment, therapy has been used to help clients discuss their childhood traumas and work through what happened. And not only childhood trauma, but any trigger or life situation that arises, which could further worsen their mental disorder or could create another one. This would be part of the nurture side, since it involves their environmental and life situation aspect. While medication would be part of the nature side, since it's the biological component of the psychological disorder development. This would be antipsychotic drugs, which block dopamine receptors, and antidepressants, which elevate serotonin levels. I forgot to mention before, there could be another argument for the nurture side of the psychological disorder and nature versus nurture argument. And that nurture argument is that there are some kids who develop psychological disorders due to the neglect in their childhood. So, like parents not being around, paying attention to the kids and neglecting them, and them having to raise themselves and or their siblings. And my dad had to raise him and his sister. So my aunt, while their parents were away at work and trying to provide for the family. And I'm going to interview my father for this. So here's my dad. So today I am interviewing my father, Greg Edwards. Hello, Greg.
Hi.
So tell me what you think nature versus nurture is.
I believe nature would be like your environment, how you were raised in your environment, and nurture would be like the loving nurturing of a mother.
Well, you were wrong about that.
Okay.
Nurture is the environment. Nature is your biological.
Well, I totally got that backwards.
Yes. So, tell me about your childhood.
I grew up with my sister in Fountain Valley, and my mom and dad both worked a lot. My mom had two jobs. She was a dental assistant, and she also worked at a restaurant at night. So my job was to fix dinner for my sister and myself, and they get home around 10 o'clock at night.
So, while my dad grew up with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is mostly just a nature instead of nurture. So instead of him developing it from the neglect of my grandparents being in his childhood, he got it from his biological factors, so his genetics. But there are some kids who, with the same neglect or worse neglect, who have developed different disorders. And those disorders could look like anxiety, so generalized anxiety or separation anxiety, and OCD, so obsessing over being in their kid's life, or just obsessing over separation. And they could have gotten personality disorders, and they could hallucinate, stay up late, so psychotic disorders, and they could develop depression. While these disorders are corrected with therapy, they still arise from the neglect in their childhood, and that stems from the nurture side of psychological disorder development. Ways to help mental disorders in your mental health is by having a good job, having a strong faith in a religion, and having a loving home situation. These and more can prevent having a disorder being triggered or a mental disorder arising. Nature and nurture, whether being its own factor or combined, has been argued in the psychological disorder aspect and how they affect it. While they have their own reasonings for being stronger in the development of human behavior, nature and nurture have been proven to have a severe impact on psychological disorders. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.